Though the mountains shake and the earth sinks down, though the waters foam and roar, though the world burns dry and creation groans, I will not be afraid.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the 6th in our 9-part series of interviews of Hymn Society leaders in preparation for the celebration of our centennial coming up this summer here in Washington, D.C. My name is Mike McMahon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada. And I am really excited today to be having this conversation with Slats Toole. Slats is a musician, writer, educator, preacher, and theater director, sound designer based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And they're an active member of the Presbyterian Church USA. In addition, of course, Slats has lots of ecumenical involvements all over the lot, which I think you'll hear about during our interview today. They hold a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drama from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts and a Master of Divinity and Certificate in Theology, Women, and Gender from Princeton Theological Seminary. Slats has led workshops on expansive language and queer theology with a particular emphasis on gender identity throughout the United States and Canada. And we've been lucky enough to have a couple of those workshops at Hymn Society gatherings. Slats' work centers around creating space in the church where all are welcomed, embraced, and loved. Glad to be with you today, Slats.
It's so good to be here. Just seeing all the names scrolling in on the screen, I'm like, I love being in community with these wonderful humans.
It is. It's great. And by the way, for those of you who have logged in, you can be part of the conversation through the chat and through the Q&A. And I'm going to put those up on my screen so that I don't forget to look at them. And we'll be monitoring those throughout the session. So if we don't get to your question during the conversation, I will spend a little time at the end to deal with any questions. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and to make comments in the chat box. And I see David Eicher has already begun the process, and Jane Best. So hello to all of you. So Slats, it's I got to know you at the Hymn Society several years back, and when we had our preliminary conversation, I got to hear a little bit about your background, like growing up and how you got involved with ministry and congregational singing from early on. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I don't think they're here today, but I had no choice as to whether or not I was going to be involved in church music because my parents are both church musicians, which meant that, of course, I was at the church more than the preacher's kids were. Some of my earliest memories were singing in church choirs, and whether or not I was always enthusiastic about going, it was what we were going to do because that's where my parents were going to be. So I grew up very deeply involved in the life of the church. My parents were joint ministers of music and education. That's music and education. So it's not that one of them was music and one of them was education, but they're both music and education at a Baptist church, actually right outside DC. When I was very young, and then we moved to Virginia, to Richmond, where we're getting a lot of greetings from Richmond in the chat already, where my mother started working at a Methodist church. So it was a part of my life that I didn't even realize how deeply ingrained it was until I actually started to get away from it. When I moved to New York City for college and suddenly had the choice of whether or not I was going to go to church, that was really when I realized how deeply music in particular and church activity in general was a part of really who I am, when I suddenly had that choice of like, okay, is this something you are going to do every week or is it not?
So what kind of things did you get involved in before you went to college? Before
I went to college?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. So one of my earliest memories was in their role as ministers of music and education, my parents put out a cassette tape for children who are preparing to enter into worship. And so I was involved in making this recording that included the doxology and the Gloria Patri and the Lord's Prayer, as well as going through classes of like how to follow a bulletin and how to search for things in a hymnal. So from there through children's choir, I was a frequent scripture reader. I was an acolyte. The Methodist church where I grew up added in a cross for a crucifer. So I was, I think, actually the first person to serve as a crucifer in that congregation, and as well as kind of whatever was necessary for the service at the time. So if I was an acolyte and the pastor left something in her office, I was probably the one called over to the pastor to go grab the whatever it was, as well as I actually one time even got to skip school to be at an organ recital of my mother's to page turn and pull out my favorite stop on the organ, which was, of course, as a small child, the Zimbelstern, because it was the instant gratification stop. I just pulled it, and then there were bells, which was so exciting. And so that became also my particular role in church.
Wow, you were really a youth ministry all-star.
I was, yes.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Did you ever feel like church wasn't a safe place for you when you were at that age?
It was mixed. I was enormously lucky, and I do say lucky rather than blessed, because to me, saying that I was blessed to be in a church where I could kind of explore my sexuality implies that God decided to not bless other people. So I will say that I was lucky. I grew up in a church that was definitely mixed on how it felt about gender and sexuality. I started figuring out my sexual orientation pretty young. I was in 5th grade when I first started having thoughts about maybe being attracted to both girls and boys, but I also didn't have the language for that. I didn't have the word bisexual. I only had gay and straight. So I figured that actually couldn't exist and that I would just figure it out later. It wasn't until someone actually came out to me as bisexual that I was like, oh, that's a thing?
Yeah.
Oh, well, this makes sense. So I came out to my parents when I was in 8th grade. I came out to one of my pastors around the same time, came out to my youth group in high school, actually, while I was on a choir trip. And while I knew that not everyone was fully on board with accepting all of who I was, people were having the conversation in a way that was led by love. So we were able to kind of meet each other at the table and say, I care for you and I respect you and I love you. And that's how we're going to move forward in this first and foremost. So my worth as a human wasn't so much debated in the church where I was. At the same time, I was getting a lot of messaging from just being raised in American Christianity, and particularly being in the South, about whether or not I had a right to even be in the church. So at the same time, I was also kind of defending my right to even be in the room and have these conversations on a larger sense. So it was mixed. I never felt unsafe. There were times within the larger context that I felt unwelcome.
Mm-hmm.
I do know a lot of people who grew up around where I grew up and beyond, who did definitely feel unsafe, and for very good reason.
Yes.
So I feel a lot of my work since then has actually stemmed from the fact that I have had that positive background in the church by and large. And so my responsibility, I think, is to then use that to help both heal what can be healed, and help call the church to account so that other people don't have to go through those kinds of experiences.
That's an awesome story, because it reminds me that, those of us who have had negative experiences with church certainly have something to offer by way of critique and witness. But your story about having positive experiences also, is like hopeful that this is possible, and not everyone has had, harmful experiences.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really, really wonderful. So it must have been a lot different, though, when you went to New York to NYU. The change of context has to have been pretty drastic, huh?
It was. I was ready for it. I did not really want to stay in Virginia. My parents were very happy to let me go because I wanted to get to New York so badly, and it. I was working primarily, going to school and working in experimental New York theater. So mostly not the stuff that goes to Broadway, the shows that happen in small black boxes in, the East or West Village with people, crawling up the wall and rolling around on the floor. And it's not the most religious environment. And it is also an environment that will take as much time as you are willing to give to it. So trying to establish a work-life balance was really difficult for me. My first year of undergrad, I was in class from 8:30 to 6 pretty much every day, and then usually in rehearsals from around 6 to midnight, and rehearsals all during the weekend. So I had to be really intentional about carving out time for, not only like sleeping, which I didn't do much of, but also going to church and nurturing my own spirituality. I did not do a good job at that my first year, and I really felt the ache. And so starting really my second year of undergrad, I started saying, hey, no, I can't be at rehearsal on Sunday morning. I have church. Which, given the fact that I was not the archetype of what a lot of people had in their brain of somebody who would consistently go to church on Sunday morning, I expected to get a lot of pushback from that, but instead I got a lot of questions. Oh, you go to church? Where do you go to church? I used to go to church, but then. And so then I became this holder of stories of the ways that people had been hurt by their church, either because of issues of sexuality or gender, or just they're artists and they tend to question everything. And not all churches are able to handle that. One of my best friends told a story about how she had some questions about someone dying and then rising again, which I think it is completely fair to have some questions about that. And was made to feel that because she could not immediately accept that she was a bad person and any good that she did in her life would be negated by her inability to just go along with that. And so I was hearing kind of so much of this hurt and pain and also longing. A tremendous amount of people who actually found something in religion, in spirituality, in ritual that spoke to them, but that it was suddenly inaccessible to them because of these experiences they had. So I started to become this kind of bridge to try to translate or explain things to people in language that hadn't been used against them. So, because there's probably something about loving people that they were going to be into. And let's make it so the church isn't this negative presence weighing on their lives. So I went to New York. I started going to, I was a Methodist at that time who really loved liturgy. So then I ended up in an Episcopal church and also in a Reformed church. I was a middle collegiate church, which I went to a pretty traditional Episcopal church, and then middle collegiate where there could be a sermon and there could be a puppet show, and they could be singing Kirk Franklin and they could be singing Handel, and they might be doing both in the same service. So it's getting this kind of broad stretch on Sunday mornings, and then inviting people to church in ways that they never really expected to come back to church. My birthday often falls around Holy Week. And so one year my birthday fell on Maundy Thursday, and I invited people. I said, hey, I'm going to be going to church. It's a really cool and weird and theatrical service where it ends with this reading of the Passion, and everything is shrouded in black, and everyone leaves in silence following this shrouded cross. If you're a theater person, love this. And then I'm going to go to this bar afterwards. So, you could meet me, either, both, whatever. And like 5 friends showed up, which really confused the rector as to why there were these like 5 college age people showing up on Maundy Thursday. But it became this really wonderful place for conversation and possible transformation. And helped me, I think, own the faith that I had grown up with. In a way.
One of the things that strikes me from listening to you talk about your high school experience and your college experience is the ability that you have to hear people's what's going on inside people and to engage them in ways that are transformational. That's that's really impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow. So I know that you were working in theater and going to church and all that, and eventually you ended up in seminary. How long? What was the journey to seminary from there?
So growing up as a very active child in the church, people kept saying that I should go to seminary, and I was having nothing to do with it. I could not see myself as a pastor. I think largely that has to do with the trajectory that I saw a pastor taking in the specific conference of the United Methodist Church where I grew up, which was, you go to seminary, you're an associate for a while, you maybe do a solo or yoked call, but the goal is to be the head pastor at a multi-staff church. And that wasn't really appealing to me as a career path. So I just assumed this is not what I want to do. I had one pastor who was very insistent. She said, all that calling stuff is between you and God. I'm just here to tell you that you're a really theologically curious person, and you would love going to seminary. When I was freelancing, I was spending my summers down at Montreat Conference Center in North Carolina, which was my preaching boot camp. My job was working AV, so I was literally paid to listen to really great speakers. And it was my theological boot camp as well, starting to learn about books of the Bible that I hadn't really encountered before. Or there was an entire conference I worked on John Calvin for his 500th birthday. And I loved being there, and I loved learning that. And at the same time, I was falling out of love with the reality of what freelance theater looks like. So I was doing it. I was making all of my money doing theater. I actually tried to get a day job and couldn't. I just kept on getting more theater jobs.
Boy, that is so counterintuitive.
It's so weird. But the problem was that none of these jobs, paid enough on their own to be able to support me. And so I would have to take so many shows to be able to make ends meet, that even the shows that I would take because, I know it doesn't pay a lot, but I'm really interested in this creatively. I wasn't able to do my best work there because I was just so overextended, to the point where there are actually a couple friends who staged a little bit of an intervention for me to let me know that it was okay to not like freelancing. And so with this kind of theological curiosity and these conversations that I was having, trying to help people who had kind of less positive upbringings in the church than myself, as well as this turn away from trying to make all my money doing theater, that is what eventually led me out to seminary. And I went to Princeton, which was, I think it was strong in the areas that I was weak. In the churches that I was going to in New York, I was getting a lot of liberation theology and Black theology and womanist theology. And I felt that I needed more of a grounding in like Calvin or Augustine, and that going to Princeton, I would be able to get that, as well as I met Martin Tell, who was delightful and was like, there's great music here, so I can I can head here.
Now, you mentioned Martin Tell, so at some point you made some kind of connection to the Hymn Society, and of course a lot of us know your parents too, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about all of that.
Yes, so this is actually one of my favorite Hymn Society stories. I was working at Montreat and the summer before I really started applying to seminaries. I was looking at places, and everyone at Montreat was very happy to give me their opinions about exactly where I should go. And I wrote my first hymn text while I was there, called Through Dust You Formed Our Mortal Flesh. And it was a creation hymn about the Big Bang, about being formed from dust. I've always loved Ash Wednesday and most like Lenten imagery. And so exploring that, and I showed this text to Eric Wall, who was the summer musician there. I was singing in the Summer Singers Choir, and he said, "This is really wonderful. You should show this to Mel Bringle." Mel was the liturgist for the Sunday morning worship services at the time, and I knew who she was, and I said, "There is no way I can show this to Mel Bringle. I am way too intimidated to show this to Mel Bringle." And Eric said, "If you don't show this to Mel Bringle, I will show it to Mel Bringle." And so the next Sunday, after, getting her set up with a microphone, as was my job, I handed this to Mel and I said, "Hey, this is a hymn text I wrote. Eric Wall said you might be interested in taking a look at it." And she said, oh, wonderful. Can I take this home for the week and then, talk to you about it next week? And I said, "Yep, sure, absolutely." And I ran back to the sound booth. And the next week she came up to me and she said, "This is your first hymn text?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Have you heard of the Hymn Society?" And I said, "No." She said, "I'm going to gift you a membership. Are you in school right now?" I said, "No, but I'm applying to seminary." She said, "Great. When you are in seminary, you need to apply for the Lovelace Scholarship. And that will pay your way, except for travel, to get to one of our conferences, because I really think you need to be a part of this group." So I said, "Okay." And then I showed up at seminary, and I knew obviously I was going to seminary, like trying to learn all the things, but I also knew I was like, okay, I have been told I need to get involved with this organization and apply for this scholarship, which, Martin helped me get that whole process started when I was actually in school. The other fun part of this is that I actually sang in a choir under David McCormick when I was in middle school in Richmond. And so I knew David and Sherry as well through all of this, small Richmond church musician world. And when Sherry was processing my membership, my parents' membership in the Hymn Society had actually lapsed. They were not current members. And so Sherry messaged my parents and said, "Well, now that Slats is a member of the Hymn Society, I think it's time for you all to re-up your membership." And so that's how Mel got the entire Toole family back involved with the Hymn Society.
That is such a great story. I mean, it was compared to Hillary Donaldson, sort of kind of grew up in the Hymn Society and her parents brought her in. But it was so cool to hear this story about you bringing your parents back into the Hymn Society. That's just a really wonderful, wonderful connection. I want to mention to everybody that, you were mentioning how much you like Lent, and all right, that isn't exactly what you said, but
I do love Lent. I do.
Okay. Well, a few years back, you did a series of essays that have now compiled into a collection called Queering Lent, and if people haven't seen that, I think that's something that is worth their read.
Thank
Perhaps,
you. Yeah.
Perhaps the good timing is good because we're just about to do it for once. Time to think about that. So seminary. What kinds of things did you encounter at seminary that were memorable for you or formative for you?
I think that, so one of the things I say about Princeton is that Princeton Seminary is conservative if you are liberal, and it is liberal if you are conservative, which means that everyone is a little bit uncomfortable, which is actually a really great space for learning and connecting, and challenged a fair amount of my own prejudices. So while administratively there were a lot of kind of struggles at Princeton, while I was there, I started to come out as non-binary, as somebody who does not identify within the gender binary. I don't identify as a man or as a woman. And I was really lucky that I didn't live on campus, because almost all of the housing was gender segregated. In fact, my partner, who is a trans man who started his transition while he was at Princeton, definitely had struggles because he was being put on all female floors, and trying to work out that kind of situation was difficult. And I don't think at that time the seminary had really grappled with a lot of what that would mean. It hadn't come up yet. And so in a way, I was one of the first guinea pigs of the seminary as far as dealing with that, which was tricky. I did the student body, I found to be really wonderful and supportive, and also challenging. And kind of going back to what I said about my own prejudices being challenged, one of my coworkers, I worked in the chapel office. I ushered for all of the chapel services, helped set up the space, best job on campus. And one of my coworkers there wasn't sure where he stood on issues of gender and sexuality, but he knew that he cared for and respected me, similar to a lot of the people who I grew up with in church. And he was meticulous about using my pronouns and using my chosen name. He was better at it than a lot of the more self-proclaimed progressive students there, who would misgender me and then say, "Oh, well, you know what I mean."
Oh.
Which, yes, I do know what you mean, but it's really not hard to just correct yourself and move forward, as opposed to kind of absolving yourself of any responsibility to, get that right. And I knew that he had this deep respect for me that challenged him, and he was allowing it to challenge him, and it wasn't something that I expected from somebody with his background. And so I actually had to do a fair amount of taking stock of what the assumptions that I came into seminary with. There were still classes where gender and sexuality were debated. I had one class that after that class, I had to go talk to the pastoral care professor for about an hour, because some of the stuff that was said was so ignorant and harmful. And then there were other times where, like, we had a symposium to open the Center for Theology, Women and Gender, where we ended up having a major trans activist, Jacob Tobiah, come in and speak. We had a panel of people of all different genders and sexualities, one of whom is now like pretty famous within certain circles, because she's been a part of the HBO show Euphoria, and like seeing that happen on campus at the same time. So it was a very mixed experience for me, but I think it challenged me in the ways that I needed to be challenged, and also the ways in which it hurt me are ways that I can continue to heal and move forward from.
Yeah, you're saying that just sort of reminds me that sometimes I feel like people don't get that I'm actually a person, not an issue.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Sometimes people just don't get that. It's they think they can speak of these things as though they're abstract, and they're not, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and I think when people historically haven't been in the room, or people haven't known that we've been in the room, with gender and sexuality, there are some ways in which I can be in a room sometimes and people won't know that I identify in a certain way, or I can say things to kind of blend in. And I think it's so easy when people either have not been in the room or have not known that we're in the room, for people to just dismiss things as issues. It's easy for a room of white people to talk about racism as an issue rather than something that affects people every minute of every day, because
Right.
we haven't had to grapple with that as much. And so I think we did see, I think that was a lot of kind of the growing pains that I was seeing at Princeton, was that reality of people being in the room that historically weren't. And how does the institution handle that and learn how to do that faithfully, which is hard. It's hard for any institution.
Sure. I mean, there are layers of privilege that are just so unspoken and hard to penetrate sometimes. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, I've had the good fortune of hearing you speak several times on issues of gender and language and worship. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing in that area, because I think that would be really interesting for people to hear.
Yeah. So this work partially started because it was, again, I didn't really have a choice. As a very openly non-binary person, especially in religious circles, I was frequently the first non-binary person that people had met, which is starting to change now. It's really delightful. It's amazing for me to see the conversations and how they have shifted in just the last 5 years, as far as how I approach the subject, what knowledge people come in with or don't. But I actually, so when I eventually became a Presbyterian, and part of the reason why I did that was because the PCUSA was a lot farther along in conversations about sexuality than the United Methodist Church was, and there are lots of reasons for that. And I felt like, okay, I'm kind of over talking about sexuality. This is not really what I want to be focusing my time on, and so I'm going to move to a place where the conversations are happening in a way that feels more productive to me. And shortly after that, I realized that I was non-binary, and I was like, dang it, I am gonna have to keep talking about stuff like this because the PCUSA definitely hasn't gotten there yet. And so so it's funny when God is like, oh, you thought you were done with, nope, you're not. And so when I was in seminary, really started having a lot of conversations with people just casually about language that was being used in worship, language that was being used in hymns, ways that churches were and were not ready to have me in the room. I was doing my field education at the time. I was working at a small church in New Jersey, and had chosen not to be out as non-binary there to the congregation, though I was out to the pastor I was working with, just because I wasn't ready to handle all of that while also trying to learn how to preach every month. And so I started developing resources while I was in seminary, because people would ask me for resources, and I would be constantly pulling things together. And so I finally codified some things together into a resource. When people said, do you have any resources? I'm like, yes. Because even at that time, a lot of the denominational resources, the denominational groups like Covenant Network of Presbyterians or More Light Presbyterians didn't have much on gender identity. More Light had a little bit more, but there wasn't a lot out there. And so starting to develop these resources and starting to create spaces where I could talk about this on my own terms, rather than just constantly being barraged with questions whenever I walked into a church space, doing the work to educate people in advance of someone like me walking into the church, was, I think, actually strengthening and healing for me. Being able to say, here's what we need, here's things that we would really like you to think about before, we come into this space. Here are things that we have experienced. I've experienced, as part of the seminary touring choir, we went down to what would be considered a pretty progressive church, and there were only 2 bathroom options, male and female. And so I went into the women's room, but didn't look like I should be in the women's room, and then got yelled at by some of the choir members who were from that church. And so how do we prevent something like that from happening? And also having the opportunity to explore more specifically things about language and music. Seminary also made me realize how deeply church music was ingrained in me, because I would get to exams and I would know answers on the exams because I had sung so many of the Psalms, or I had sung words from Revelation and doing the Messiah or whatever. And so as that was kind of an interest in writing, and language has always been an interest of mine, this allowed me to explore that in a really specific way that I found fascinating. And it's been really fun to see kind of the progression of the resources that are available and the questions I get throughout the years of doing this work. So I've been presenting, I will say that in my bio, I say, throughout the United States and Canada. It's the Hymn Society that has allowed me to add "and Canada" to that one. It was my last workshop before the pandemic was with the Ambassadors program in Halifax. So did a bit of that. I've presented both in specifically church music-y spaces, but also as someone who came through kind of pastor training, I'm connected with a lot of organizations that are geared more towards pastors and that area of study. And so like the Next Church Conference, or I've been working now, I'm on the board of Covenant Network of Presbyterians, and we've been doing small local conferences. We just did one in November in Charlotte to really help people come together on a local level to learn about these issues, have a local support group in doing that. And it's mostly for the churches that are like, we want to do better, but we don't know how. It's like, yes, I am happy to come in and help you with that.
And what would be your number one suggestion to churches that are asking that question?
My number one suggestion would be listen. It is really tempting for us to want to program all of the answers, and to say, oh, well, I've heard that this place does this, so we've got to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. Whereas your needs and the needs of your congregation might be different than the church down the street. So listen to what people are saying both within your church, listen to voices that are willing to educate on whatever you are working on, and then take that to heart and say, okay, what are the things that we are holding on to that aren't helpful in this case? What are, whether that be, we really love our how our programming is split up between women's groups and men's groups, how that gives people, the space to be, and like, great, like those groups exist for a reason. But if that's your only programming, there is no spot for me. Listening to say, oh, right, listening to people saying like, oh, I don't identify within this gender binary, so maybe that means that we have to change our language in choir rehearsal from ladies or women and men to sopranos and altos and tenors and basses. And being willing to do the work to undo those habits, because they are definitely habits. I have misgendered my friends who have transitioned because I knew them before, and so I will mess up sometimes, but it is then up to me to undo that habit.
Yeah, I was really impressed when you sort of made a similar point before that, we do make mistakes, but it's our responsibility then to embrace them and work through them. Mm-hmm. Very important. You've been involved in the Hymn Society now for a good while, and I'm wondering, what you see the Hymn Society, how it can either foster deeper change or perhaps embrace deeper change itself from your perspective.
One of the things that I've really loved and appreciated about the Hymn Society, as a distinct from a lot of other organizations that I've been involved with. I've been involved in a lot of, particular denominational organizations, and the Hymn Society has been a place where I've seen people from very different traditions come together and share and learn from each other. I think part of what allows the Hymn Society to do that is that we're not necessarily, and I'm going to put an asterisk on this that I will come back to, we're not necessarily fighting for space. So having been in a lot of different denominations that have gone through schisms based on issues of gender and sexuality, I'm more easily able to talk to somebody from a denomination that is not my own, or a denomination that is split off from my own, because we're not fighting for dominance in the same organization anymore. We are acknowledging that we have differences and recognizing that within that there are places that we still have things that we can learn from each other. And so the fact that, the Hymn Society is not a denomination makes it, I think, easier for us to come together with folks who are completely outside of what our own worship might look like, who do things in very different ways and not feel threatened by that presence. The asterisk that I come back to is that within any organization, there are going to be cultural norms. That's a thing that happens in any system of people. And so I think our growth point, we do kind of have a center in primarily, I would say, mostly Protestant strophic hymnody, because we have a lot of people and a lot of churches and a lot of writers who do that very, very well in this space, and that's wonderful. And I think our continuing growing edge is going to be, how do we make sure that we honor that culture without prizing it above others, and making sure that we are being open to the things that we have not already thought about, and that we do things not just that make us comfortable, but that push our edges of comfort. And I don't think this is a group that would, center one particular culture maliciously. We're just so very excited about the work that we do and the work that we're good at. And so I think that moving forward, I really do dream of the Hymn Society as this place where people from a variety of traditions and cultures and community can come together and sit at a table where there is no hierarchy together and learn from each other. And I've experienced that at the Hymn Society, and I think it is our responsibility to try to carry that spirit forward and notice where we have, like, where our own assumptions and where our own prejudices stop us from doing that.
It's very well said. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but I just want to stop for a second and say there are no questions in the Q&A. And if anybody wants to pose a question, this would be the time to do it. And also, an aside, Wendy Donaldson got into the chat and said, well, you know, that she and Andrew are really not the ones responsible for Hillary's involvement in the Hymn Society. It was Michael Hahn who was the one who got her involved. She just happened to grow up there, but she thought it really was something for her parents and learned it was really something for her too. So.
We could also blame Michael Hahn a little bit for me, given that both my parents at some point in their higher education were connected with Michael, and so there's, you know, I'm the youngest. My brother is 5 years older than me, and he was a baby when my mother was in seminary. And I believe that Michael saw him as a baby, but did not see me. But, you know, it's a very connected world.
Well, I think that anytime we can blame Michael Hahn for something, we really need
absolutely.
And he just weighed in the chat too and said, "My life is justified now." Thank you. Well, I wonder if there's anything else that you'd like to say to the folks that are watching before we bring this to a close.
So somebody, I just saw in the Q&A, somebody asked about.
I'm sorry.
They just, I'm if I see a notification, I'm like, ooh. That appreciate some description of some of my teenage experiences, which I'm not sure if that question is centered primarily around like identity or primarily about the church, but I can kind of speak around that. So I went to, where am I going to start on this? Growing up, where I grew up, when I grew up, I was being told by a lot of the culture around me that I was a predator. I was so anxious in locker rooms, not because of fearing any harm for myself, but because I did not want to be accused of anything. Because as someone attracted to all genders, you cannot win in any locker room. And so I was kind of hyper vigilant about how any of my actions came off to anyone. I was living in a time when I was discovering my sexuality in time, and in a place where sodomy books were still on the laws, or sodomy laws were still on the books. And so even though I wasn't at a point where that was going to be relevant, it was still something that was weighing on me. And it meant that, like, even as I went forward into relationships, I wanted to make sure that there was no way that anyone could possibly accuse me of anything, because that's how, because I was essentially told that I was not right, and that anything, like, the law would never side with me, and things would always be my fault. I share this story partially because, partially just to say that that's a reality for a lot of us growing up the way we did, but also to share one of the most transformational experiences I had, which was when I came out to a part of my youth group. I did not want to come out to my youth group for pretty much the same reasons, where, whenever we would go on a trip, we'd be bunked, women and men together, and that, like, women with women, men with men. And I did not want to be accused of anything or make people feel uncomfortable in any way. I was on a choir trip I was at Worship and Music Arts Week at Lake Junaluska, and I had just come back in the room after having a long phone conversation with my girlfriend at the time. And I was rooming with a few high school girls who were a little bit older than me. And they were somewhat the gossipy type in a kind way. They were always trying to set me up with the preacher's kid, and wanted something to be happening. And so when I came back in the room, I said, "Were you on the phone with your boyfriend?" And I said, "No, but I was on the phone with my girlfriend." And they said, "Oh my gosh, tell us everything. What's her name? When did you meet? How long have you been dating?" And it was just so normal. It was exactly the response that they would have had if I had said, "Yes, that was my boyfriend." They were so excited. They were very excited to know the gossip. They wanted to know everything. And that was one of my most transformational experiences within the church, when it had been an experience of high anxiety, where they took what was shameful for me and helped me see, like, no, this is fine, and we're going to be fine, and you're going to be fine, and we can exist together. And that they also didn't have to support everything about my sexuality to have that response. They could have been praying for me to be saved from the fires of hell on their own, as far as I know, but in that moment when I needed compassion and acceptance and love, then that is what I got. And so there's some contrasting experiences of my kind of growing up that hopefully that is helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Noel Werner added a comment that I think is a helpful way for us to end, which is, he would add to your advice by saying, "Be ready to learn." They certainly taught me a lot when they were at Nassau and Princeton. So thank you for that. And I think that's something I come away from this conversation with too, that your witness is just so powerful, and your witness of listening and building bridges and being true to yourself while respecting others is just wonderful. So thank you so much, Slats.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I did want to say that next month in March, we will be continuing this series with Cynthia Wilson, who is an executive for worship and music at Discipleship Ministries in Nashville, and is former board member of the Hymn Society. And I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation as well. Also, we're going to be continuing our webinar series with a workshop by Maria Cornu on Latin American song. She was the managing editor of the ecumenical bilingual hymnal Santo, Santo, Santo. And she's really got a lot to say about language too, which will be an interesting follow-up to what we talked about here by way of language. And finally, if you have not registered for the Hymn Society Conference, early bird registration goes through March 15th. And we've already had really good response. So we're hoping to have a great turnout to celebrate the 100th anniversary. Some kudos are coming in on the chat from David Eicher and Michael Hahn.
Oh, we could do a whole spinoff on that.
and Sharon Beckstead and others. So thanks so much. Slats, again, thanks for a great conversation today. Hope to see you again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a joy. It's always great to spend time with you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We will not be afraid.